right? Is in fact, if you want to read up about how much we are preoccupied with what is happening in the world, I urge you to go back to the Human Development Report that UNDP published. And in fact, our last Human Development Report was focused on what is happening to us in terms of polarization, the uncertainty that is driving people into being more and more fearful of the future, and therefore losing trust in the institutions, turning on each other, declaring their neighbors the greatest enemy, and essentially creating the conditions where this idea of human security that UNDP has unapologetically articulated over 30 years, and I think is more relevant than ever today, is under assault. So no fears on that front. But you know what is interesting? And again, being the son of a farmer, I still have a lot of contacts with farmers, right? Why is it that farmers are the first ones who are today turning against government, also turning against the ecological parties, the so-called green allies that you would expect them to actually consider their greatest friends? Because we have lost, in a sense, the confidence of the farming community when we talk about ecological transitions. A farmer in Germany today spends probably a third of their time either on a tractor or in their office late at night, entering data into computers that report to offices that will never actually come back unless you are unlucky enough, just like a tax inspector, to be picked out by accident. I mean, it's a caricature, but let's be honest, the regulatory approach to farming is absolutely well intended, but it's turning farming into a nightmare for people who can hardly make the ends meet. So why are we having tractors all over Brussels, all over Berlin, and so on? I think because we also need to go back to fundamentals. What is it that enables a farmer to exercise agency, not to be essentially talked through forms and computers about how they should get up in the morning and practice farming? There is a paradigm shift also needed here. In part, it's not calling on the more fundamental tendencies in our elections, but I think you picked out the farmers, so I wanted to come back on that. I think there is a very real problem here, and it has to do also with those who believe that they're actually the greatest advocates for farmers.
Martin, on that note, we're not just talking about farming per se, we're talking about food systems with the 7 sets that are involved. And again, more complicated. How do we come to grips in a situation where people refuse to acknowledge that the world that we live in is actually a bit more complicated than going to McDonald's?
Well, maybe a couple of things to the question of the European Union. It was staggering to see when Russia invaded in Ukraine, immediately there were calls to undo the EU agricultural policy, and the argument was, oh my gosh, the world is hungry, we need to produce no matter what, and we cannot afford to have any area that is not used for farming. Now in Berlin, the Humboldt University ran the numbers, and it turned out that the impact would have been less than a cent per ton of wheat, so it's neglectable. So always be distrustful where that calls are coming from. No, the European Union doesn't have to feed the world. The world is very well able to feed itself if we are managing the system transformation. And I want to come to one thing that Achim said in the penultimate intervention, which is so absolutely central. It's the stewardship for the land. And if we look at farmers as what they are, the human interface between our life support system and our human systems, we need to completely value farmers at a different level. And I find it ridiculous that we were talking about climate change for 26 years before finally we started in a very timid way to speak about food systems, when we know that carbon dioxide is not a toxic. It's not like the Montreal Protocol where you need to phase out Kohlenwasserstoff, I have no idea what that is in English, but it is just about closing natural circles. And that is something that a good farmer does. A good farmer is someone who makes the land better, who improves the soil. And that brings me to the lady from the Alpenland. It's a fantastic point, and I want to give you one data point which illustrates your point so wonderfully. On the market in the United States in 1914, you had 124 different sorts of apples you could buy. Today it's 6. It's all standardized, and they're all tasteless, and they are all full of pesticides and pretty empty of nutrition. If we can get people, and particularly children, back in touch with the land, if we can have, please, apple trees in the schoolyard, I think we would go in the right direction. And Conny, last sentence, what makes me very hopeful here is you can always see with young people in urban contexts where the wind is going. And who would have thought that urban farming becomes a thing for young people when it was considered 30 years ago about the most square thing you could possibly do as a petit bourgeois, and now it's a trend thing. So slowly we're going in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah, seeing that we have the Lord Mayor of London, I'm quite sure that you've seen these patches of green where suddenly sort of gardeners come and suddenly the roundabout is green the next day and nobody knows who's done it. And if it wasn't for the cars, you would actually be able to eat the stuff. But I'm not quite sure whether it will work. I would like to come back to one aspect that was mentioned before, but with a question mark, and I know that you're a fan, agroecology. And what we've heard is it's a new idea, it seems like a new idea, maybe it is not new, I'm not a farmer's daughter, but it is more than just an approach to farming. It is a mindset, as you said, but take us along, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite important. A few years ago, well, now we are talking about agroecology here in conferences, in the Global Food System Summit, in different conferences. UNDP uses the term a lot to support smallholder farmers all over the world. But a few years ago, it wasn't like that at all. Many organizations, stakeholders, donors were supporting one type of agriculture that pretended to be sustainable, which was called climate smart agriculture. The name is very, very catchy, no? It's very good for marketing purposes. It's doing something in a better way that's going to consider the sustainability objectives. But in reality, it wasn't that much, or it wasn't at all. For example, in many cases, climate smart agriculture is to produce a lot of soybeans, deforesting the Amazon, generating biodiversity loss. In some cases, they reduce the use of synthetic fertilizers by 10%, but they still used a lot. That destroyed ecosystem soil. No? So it wasn't smart at all. No? Like what was promised to be smart. And many other terms that are related to greenwashing sustainable agriculture are now being used all over the world. Agroecology, not necessarily, there's hope in it, because it's not only about soil health and different crops growing in rotation, leaving fallow like the land for some period. It's not only that, but it also addresses many of the social objectives that other models of sustainable agriculture don't address. So in many cases, that's why it also comes from the social movements, actually, comes from the food sovereignty movement, but it addresses also what was my concern in talking about quinoa or superfoods, that these foods don't get to the local communities that need it the most. When we talk about agroecology, if well implemented, the priority should be the local communities, the local markets, not necessarily the people that want to buy these in fancy supermarkets in the global north. And that changes something. That is a change of paradigm that would really transform food systems. And just one last idea related to that. And Jessica mentioned this briefly at the end, which was climate smart agriculture was used. It really didn't mean anything. Other approaches are being used. Many different stakeholders all over the world are saying, oh, agroecology sounds sexy. I'm going to use it. I'm probably going to do similar things in how I grow different crops, but I'm going to use it because now it's sexy. And that's a threat, cooptation. And the main issue here is that agroecology can only work well, and you've both mentioned issues related to land. Agroecology can only work well if there's a land reform in many of the countries that concentrate land ownership. How difficult is it to talk about land reform with governments? Very, very difficult. That's why we don't do it. But that's the big threat that we need to confront. How do we do it? I think we have many ideas in this conversation, but there's no clear answer.
If it was easy, somebody else would do it. Was the standard saying of a former Minister of Development in Germany. So you have here the most competent people, not just in the panel, but also in the audience. I have to follow my own rules. I see that time is running out, so I'm just going to do the typical journalistic thing, like I'm going to start a sentence and I'm going to finish it, and I'm going to roll the ball backwards. Exactly. So in 5 years' time, not only are you going to have the best work that ever has come out of the New Institute, but in 5 years' time, we are on the road to food systems that are sustainable, climate resistant, and biodiverse, because?
I wish I had your positive vision of the future. I'm a little bit, I'm going to question that.
Which obstacles have we overcome in order for that sense to become?
We have to really question the foundations of our system if we want to raise real ambition. Actually, and this is not an advertisement for the new institute, but there are many scholars here working on that, and questioning what we need to change. Yeah, we don't need to go to a socialist past where the agriculture and the food systems didn't work. But we need to seriously question what's going on.
Thank you, Martin. In 5 years' time, these conditions are met if
we have millions of dialogues such we had this evening, and if we have truly managed to get farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, in national planning on a full scale.
Thank you very much. Also for mentioning again that it's an atomized business. It's not, there might be a couple of big wigs, but on the whole, you have many. But I'm not going to repeat the first part of the sentence, so your optimism was shining through the whole evening. Don't let me down.
And thank God there are still optimists in the world, because I think part of our problem today, is particularly with younger generations, is that those who are in charge have often lost their confidence in change, in the possibility of change. And I want to go back to what Jessica spoke to quite explicitly, and to some extent also Maya, in terms of the global governance. Power does not always stay with those who have it yesterday or today. And the fact that the climate movement was taken over by a 14-year-old sitting with a poster on the steps of a parliament in Sweden somehow escapes people. The fact that young people are today driving change in so many countries, including overthrowing, decade-old autocracies, seems to escape people. I mean, every day on the planet, I find examples of the most extraordinary groups of people changing things that were deemed just like unchangeable. There was a Berlin Wall in Germany, one day it just opened up, right, and it's gone. And many people thought in my generation that would never happen in our lifetime. So, first things, don't think about the future in terms of what's happened in your past, right? Your past, because that's also important. Secondly, I think we are perfectly capable of moving towards that kind of agroecology future. And I'm not in disagreement on how difficult and how frustrating the journey is, but it's already happening in parts. And that alone is proof that you can change things, and it has a lot to do with challenging power. The fact that the majority of the world's food is actually produced by smallholder farmers, as we heard, and yet it is 6 companies who, through the segment of food trade that they control, determine an entire agricultural economy in the world, is a contradiction people are not going to accept anymore if the price they pay for it is land degradation on a scale never seen before in modern human history. I remind you, there is this 3rd convention that is often neglected, the Desertification Convention, and I think we are beginning to see it coming, in a sense, to the fore right now, because we have overlooked it for too long. And again, please remember, if you think power can't change, the power sector was the most monopolized, state oligopoly-driven, post-war sector in our economy. And with regulatory changes driven by citizens, we have turned it upside down in more and more countries. That's why, as of last year, the new infrastructure being built for electricity generation is, in terms of renewables, larger than oil, gas, coal, nuclear combined. So don't just take the word of those who maybe are frustrated that they didn't do it in their time. We can change this, and it is changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I said the example that he would quote is, we have spent so much time in trying to apply science and technology in a sense to replace nature rather than to build on the ingenuity of nature. And 2 examples he gave, and it is fascinating to me, because when I started looking into it, I was perplexed. Perennial food crops. I'm sure they are on your radar, but it is phenomenal that in the year 2024, there is virtually no research worldwide, except in a few places, some brave academics are actually looking at, why do we not go back to perennial food crops? Imagine not having to plow up and field every year and replant. Imagine the nutrient flows that could come from having multi-year crops. And they exist, but we don't invest in them. Why? Who will earn money from a farmer who buys a seed and then for the next 5 to 10 years doesn't need you anymore? Second example, the whole ingenuity of photosynthesis. I mean, why are we not investing more in actually enhancing the photosynthesis? And there is some research, but when you compare it to where we are, another example of not being able to work with nature. And we talk about the conventions, we talk about a lot of the thinking that is going on about how to overcome silos. All of you spoke to this. It's a 3rd area. I think we treat the challenge of feeding the world as essentially a consumer product outcome pipeline, rather than understanding that there is this entire economy around which farmers are trying to survive. in which the world is trying to make the incentives that it provides to those who are looking after our ecological assets are actually forced to mine the very assets that they have. So in my role currently as the head of the UN Development Program, I'm constantly going back to the tool, the aid that we managed to somehow agree in 2015 called the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are, by their very design, first of all, focusing on the great risks of our time. We always talk about the goals, but actually the genesis of the goals is in the recognition of the risks to humanity that we are not able to address. And secondly, they're a template where you can connect immediately your focus, your passion maybe on SDG 2, with SDG 1 on poverty reduction, SDG 13 maybe on climate change, or biodiversity, or wherever, in a sense, your passion may lie, but you can no longer go into verticals. I think we often underestimate the value of the SDGs as a way of making us think in systemic responses.
Thank you very much. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, this was the only long speech we're going to have now, but that was by design. It was not boring, it was just long. So that was by design. And I'm picking up a couple of the issues when you talk about nature-based solutions, but of course we're looking at nature-based solutions in other areas too. Can I just do some bit of stage work? Can we move forward 10 centimeters? Because Achim does have a halo, and he deserves one, but maybe not in the context of staying here in front. Martin, I mentioned not only are you sort of the head in Berlin for the UN Food Program, and certainly upset about the fact that there's not money spent on the organization from this country at the moment. But you've also sort of been at this big conference that happened a long time beforehand. Everybody worked, 5 streams, blah blah. And then there was so little that came out of it. Now, there was a whole community behind it. How do you overcome that maybe disappointment? How do you keep the momentum going? And what do you do from UN, from the World Food Program side to maybe get the move on, to do something in the next 5 years? And now you don't have half an hour.
Great. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be moderated as someone who spent 2 years of his life working a leg off to make the summit happen. Then very little came out of it. I would respectfully disagree, because the whole work about talking about food system really took off, I think, with this summit, and it's not happening overnight. But there's a very interesting document that never seen the light of the broader public, which is the last draft of our outcome document that we had before it went into the political process. That was 3 times consulted with member states, with experts, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that because I'm replacing my lady boss today, but gender is one of the absolute main drivers. You cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly not SDG 2, unless you look into the power dynamics. And the power dynamics are such that in many countries, women and smallholder farmers, which is in some places of the world almost synonymous, are not really participating in local decision making. And if you look at the COP process, all of the negotiations, the Paris Agreement and the rule book, it's all done. The question is on implementation, and the implementation is with member states and their national determined contribution and their national action plans. So an absolute key driver is all of society participation in making these plans, which are absolutely central for the future of these countries. And Conny, if you give me 1 more minute, I would just like to drop one idea, which I call the tacit assumptions. It's time we challenge some of the tacit assumptions. One is there is not enough land available. It's simply not true. If you have 50 to 60% of the world's soils being moderately to severely degraded, and I think in your presentation I've seen UNCCD, then there is an enormous potential to bring these soils, this land, back to arable use. And then the second tacit assumption, and I close with that, is labor intensive. All the idea of a green revolution is tacitly built on the idea that only agriculture that is very little labor intensive is good agriculture, but diverse production systems, forgotten crops, agroforestry models, land restoration are extremely labor intensive, and that is a good thing because you've got so many people who are desperate to earn a living. And let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me time. And you know that I'm always a bit contrary at the beginning, so of course, and there must be a reason why you've got 2 more grey hairs than 3 years ago. Anyway, a lot of work, José. we have already heard it from Jessica. In between, there was sort of one throwaway sentence, almost throwaway sentence. We have to look at food, we have to look at climate change, look at biodiversity, but we actually have to look at much, much more. So we have to take a higher ground, so to say. How can we ascertain a higher ground, and from that higher ground, not forget what is on the ground?
One issue that is key here is what do we do with governments? They are not moving fast enough. Year after year we talk about raising ambitions, but we are realizing that we are not going to get to the 1.5 degrees, like I mentioned. We are not going to do things fast enough for the threat of the situation that we have. But mainly after the conventions, thousands go to these conventions, and then they say, we've achieved these commitments that are going to change the situation. Greenwashing, 1.5 degree washing. If we talk about food systems, we're talking about nutrient washing, we're talking about social impact washing. There are many washings here, and we are not really addressing the changes that we need. Before coming here, I was actually advising UNDP on food systems, and before that I was Minister of Production in Peru. Many in this room have heard me talk about the Peruvian anchoveta, the Peruvian anchovy. I was in charge of the largest, as minister, I was in charge of supervising the largest fishery in the world, the Peruvian anchovy, which is millions of tons in the Peruvian Ocean, one of the most productive oceans in the world. Those millions of tons of anchovy are extracted. 99% of those anchovies are transformed into fish oil and fish meal to feed pork and to feed other fishes from aquaculture in distant places like China. Not to feed 50% of the Peruvian population that is suffering from food insecurity. But what's going on here with this main problem? It's like reasonable. Why don't you use the wealth of the riches of your very productive ocean to feed insecure Peruvians or hungry Peruvians? And one answer for that is that our DNAs of our governments are focused on economic growth. The DNA that I had as a minister, the mandate that public officials had, the mandate that representatives from other organizations that were advising us had was how to increase production, how to increase GDP. Nutrition objectives were not considered part of our DNA as ministers. Environmental objectives were not considered part of our DNA. The Minister of Environment had to fight with us against, even if they had an ally, in my case, that was focused on many of the environmental objectives. So this doesn't only happen in Peru, it happens in many countries, or I may dare to say in most countries all over the world. The ministries that have these mandates related to the economy and the production are the most powerful. If you sit here, all the ministers, like in these cabinet meetings that we had, the most powerful, the ones that carry like the decisions, the voice, were the ministries related with economy, with finance, of course, and with production. So how can we be able to change these governments in time to address these changes? I don't think it's going to be possible really if we don't, and there comes like the big challenge. We need to redesign our governments, of course, to include environmental, sustainability, and nutrition and social objectives in those ministries that don't have it, or empower the other ministries that have those mandates. But we also need to redesign our democracies. No? They are not working for this challenge right now, for these threats that we are facing right now. And that implies actually one of the main ideas from Maya Groff on the planetary governance. She's the prime chair of the planetary governance program here at the New Institute, and that's one of the main challenges. If we can have governments that can raise the ambition, we need some global governance.
Global governance, everybody's looking at the UN system and also saying, it's all we have, but it could be better. Sorry, nothing personal. I'm just sort of reflecting what's out there. Thank you very much for that. So, and redesigning governments, easy task, yes. Especially seeing that the people who would really have to redesign it are the ones who would not want to change things. So I'm not quite sure how we would get along that on a democracy strengthening issue, but maybe you have a couple of ideas that you will share with us later. I think let's go a bit closer to the ground, even though you've taken us with your two examples really closely. What does UNDP actually do to incorporate the new ideas? Of course, development program should incorporate everything, fight climate change, creating a bigger base for biodiversity, bringing about social justice, gender justice. How do you do it on the ground and with microfunctions?
Well, let me begin by saying that we help countries to look at their reality through a more systemic lens. I mean, you could speak to that maybe in your previous incarnation with UNDP. I mean, UNDP, like any entity, has also evolved over time. I mean, if you go back to 1965 when UNDP was established, it was a classical technology science transfer platform for an aid project kind of vehicle. Today, you mentioned governance. I mean, a great deal of what UNDP does is to help governments to revisit and reflect on governance systems, including whether it is sometimes the very simple notion of decentralization, localization, but also increasingly to look at, for example, a sector like agriculture or power production from the vantage point of how can a transition, a transformation happen. And let me here for a second just make a slight counter proposition. I'm the first one to say that we are in deep trouble. But I'm not part of those who actually think that all governance reforms and all international efforts have actually failed. I would challenge you today, and I would challenge you also to comment on this, that just on the issue of, for example, transitions to cleaner energy systems, it is a phenomenal thing that is happening right now. The fact that it took us 20 years longer than it should have done, that we are behind the timeline on the scale, or the timeline of 1.5 is one thing. But there's an energy revolution happening across the world today, and it's not driven by either Silicon Valley or Shenzhen, it's actually happening all over the world. So would that have happened without a IPCC, without a global convention on climate change that every year is forcing everybody to come to the table again? No, it wouldn't have happened. And that's how we transform markets. And it was citizens, and this is part of the governance democracy model, right? It was citizens in their impatience, watching what is happening around them, that have driven governments to actually reform a system that was beginning to be in real danger. Just like, you can go back to the 19th century, when essentially inequality and poverty in a rapidly industrializing Europe forced the kind of reforms that created social welfare systems, social safety nets. We are in an equivalent phase of human history when it comes to climate change. The problem is everything is now unraveling so fast that we are struggling to keep up with the, let's say, steepness of that curve. UNDP's work is right now to help, for example, with the green transition. It is to also help with the future opportunities, digital transitions, artificial intelligence, the ability to rethink the whole food systems approach. I mean, we speak about a lot of things that are rooted in the way we produce food right now. There's a whole universe of possibility on how we will produce food, just 20, 30 years down the line. And that's part of what my role also as head of UNDP is to force the organization to confront the choices of the future in order to help governments and societies today to make smarter choices.
Thank you very much for that explanation, and I hope you don't mind also
No, please push.
those kind of questions. Martin, I have listened to you earlier, and again, I'd like a bit more concrete on-ground description of what the organization that you're working for and with is actually doing on the ground. And there's something called landscape approach, which has sort of come up in the last 5 years. Conferences on it, and as one example, just dropping the hat as a moderator, just as a reporter of another conference, there's a famous photographer, Sebastião, who's actually changed not just the farm of his father, who was completely barren, in 25 years. Now everything is green. He is taking the concept, or his son is taking the concept, because he's 80 now, he's taking the concept and he's actually going to turn a whole region within Brazil, with the help of financiers from all over the world, into a green area, which then gives farmers the chance to work with their own agency. Martin, how do you work as an agency? What can you contribute? You don't have finance to sort of have individuals push, but
I need to say that the World Food Programme has two functions. One is humanitarian aid. We do come in wherever there is a situation and people are starving. But we also have a mandate to actually address root causes of hunger. And it's easy to imagine that that second mandate is chronically underfinanced as we are running from one emergency to the next. But nevertheless, in that area, and that is largely also thanks to Germany and to BMZ financing that, we are doing landscape restoration in the north of the Sahel region, actually trying to push back the desert, having restored more than 300,000 hectares of land with a methodology, and we often speak about innovation and the role of innovation with a methodology that is clearly more than 2,000 years old. But the idea of rainwater harvesting, of bringing back mixed systems, does work today because we're also using what is today available, micro-insurances, for example, financial inclusion, school meals to ensure that the kids can be there, and social protection schemes that help farmers to stand back on their own 2 feet. And again, I think what's needed there is, of course, finance, which is, and we have hard evidence for that, an absolute fraction of the cost you would later spend on humanitarian aid if you fail to support the smallholder farmers. But it's also a participatory approach. I'm always saying it's maybe 1/7 about technology and 6/7 about getting the community together, getting the framework conditions, and working on things with government as fundamental as tenure rights for women, which is a very important one in order to trigger that positive development. Achim asked to comment on what he just said. I wanted to add one comment, and I absolutely agree. I think one thing that we see increasingly in UN processes is participation of people from the ground. Farmer associations, indigenous associations, youth representatives, and I've seen that participation in different fora, and it always added value. This is really an improvement of the existing system without entirely reinventing the wheel. The challenge, however, is, and I'm coming to the humanitarian side of our work, is that by today about 62% of our beneficiaries do live in fragile contexts. And so if you work, let's say, in the Darfurs, then which government can ensure your right to food? And in this fragile context, we are facing a double challenge. A, there is no government, or there is no responsible government. But on the other side, if we don't deliver for these people, we will see more fragmentation and more failed states. So this needs to be addressed in order to keep the entire international order functioning.
Yeah, the pressure is of course also enhanced by climate change because people will leave their land if they can't live off it. Thank you so much for your argument. We've been talking about climate change, we've been talking about transforming systems and approaches and procedures. We have not talked about biodiversity. Maybe you'd like to pick up that ball and the challenges that are not being talked about as much in the field of agriculture and food production.
Yes, and actually I agree that one of the most important advances in the last few years has been having a systemic vision of food. It was like, we didn't have it before, like a couple of decades ago, we were only talking about increasing productivity in the agricultural sector, and a key institution there is UNDP, of course, because it's like the centralizer of the SDGs with this systemic perspective. And actually, one example related to sustainability and biodiversity that I want to raise is related to quinoa, or to these superfoods. Quinoa, grown in Bolivia and Peru, a superfood that became very popular in the 90s, actually in the US and in Europe. The demand increased exponentially because not only delicious, I love it, but also highly nutritious and climate resilient in many cases. No? But every time someone mentions quinoa during this food systems debate globally, I get like PTSD. Why? Because the story is not as good as it appears to be. No? Because the reasoning behind quinoa seems to be very simple. Let's produce this superfood for the global north that is going to be highly demanded, it's going to be very expensive, and it's going to increase the incomes of the smallholder farmers. No? Sounds good. Who's going to go against that? But what happens in reality? Because we're talking about a system. The system reacts in unexpected ways. In this case with quinoa, many of the farmers in Peru and Bolivia that depended on that crop in their diets of course have big diversity, or not necessarily big diversity, but some diversity, but quinoa was fundamental. But because they had to sell all the quinoa to the US and to Europe, they were replacing, or they replaced in many cases, the quinoa in their diets with ultra-processed food, with rice, with bread and pasta. That of course changed dramatically their nutrition. Many of the communities that grow quinoa, that have been growing quinoa for decades or centuries in Bolivia have like super high rates of malnutrition and food insecurity, which is an amazing paradox. Rich communities, ancestral knowledge to grow quinoa, they export like the superfoods for the elites and for the global north, and then they get the cheap foods that were invented by the global north, ultra-processed food and Coca-Cola. But, so, what can we do in this situation? I was incensed last week when I read an op-ed at the New York Times, written by a chef, probably with very good intentions, saying, I have the answer for the future of food, which is, I have the grains that should be the next quinoa. That was the title of the op-ed, actually. And the chef of African origin was saying, we should export, the world should discover fonio, millet, sorghum, teff. Because these grains should replicate what happened with quinoa. Like, we are confusing what the challenge is really. Many of the farmers in these communities increased their income, no? But they had also many other problems. Conny is telling me that I've extended my time in this story, but I'll finish with a couple of ideas that we need to consider, because this is not only about superfood. This is mostly about questioning the market mechanisms for food. Food is not just another commodity. Food has the economic role, but it also has the essential role of being a nutritious food for people that need it. No? But when we make that question, we question structurally the system that considers that all products, all food products, have to be in a capitalist system sold as such. I also propose non-market mechanisms like school meals. The government can buy quinoa at a fair price and can distribute it through school meals and through other programs to communities that need it the most. No? But I think that's one measure that should be taken, but more should be considered to restructure how we think about these food products in our society.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to give you a minute if you want, opportunity to respond to that. Like capitalist system, throwing out, replacing it with something that is different, but maybe serves people better.
I don't want to be ideological, but what we have learned over the last years, with first the COVID crisis and then the attack on Ukraine, is how very vulnerable the global food system is. And what we currently struggle with at the World Food Programme is not only, in inverted commas, the big crisis as you see in Sudan, Gaza, Lebanon, of course we do, but underlying there is a toxic mix of loss of value of local currencies, inflation rates, and level of debt in sub-Saharan African countries, which is really dangerous, an increase in interest rates that results in hyperinflation and inflation in many places, which is affecting staple foods. So you do see that this dependency on imports is actually becoming a very big problem. Now, I'm not advocating for autarky or not having trade, quite on the contrary. I think one instrument that would be really worth much better developing is, for example, continental trade in Africa, which is still underdeveloped trade between African countries. If you look at the European Union, a big part of our food security is exactly that. But when it comes to nutritious food, there is nothing like local production, because it basically comes at zero costs. If you have your own seeds, and you alluded to that, if you have perennial crops, all of that. And it's the clever mixtures of that. So if you're coming to school meals, why not having community gardens with the children where they grow their own food? If you have smallholder farmers and you encourage them to do more production of fresh produce, vegetables and fruit and so on, you can at the same time purchase the production for the school meals, and so try to kickstart a system in which people don't only have enough calories, but are actually nourished in a way which is good for their health and for the future of their children.
If you want to comment, you may. If not, then I sort of add.
Will we get another chance at the end?
And definitely, yes,
And
that's
go
why
on
I would
with
like
the
to
audiences,
sort of
yeah.
the audience to get ready, and me just sort of turning it a little bit. All of this systemic approach, whether within capitalist society or without, always is this systemic aspect, and you're not quite sure whether you turn one lever, will it lead to a vicious or to a virtuous circle? Will it have all positive results. I mean, just like all our SDGs, some of them are actually sort of fighting each other. How do we come to grips when our thinking, I'm sorry, I'm leaving sort of the basis now, but when our thinking as human beings is not as systemic as the systems we've created? This is almost philosophical, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared, there's nothing in this book.
I'll give you a very brief response because I know you want to turn to the audience also. So I think, over time, human beings, societies, whether at the local level or in larger societies, civilizations we sometimes refer to, are perfectly capable of evolving, of having paradigm shifts. And I think we are in fact the most privileged generation in human history because we have today the ability to be informed not only by either an intuitive understanding or an ecological passion, but we're actually able to watch the entire planet from satellites. We can measure virtually everything that's happening on our planet today. We have the advent of artificial intelligence that allows us to, in a sense, understand what is happening to the planet and also to develop entirely new economies. The question I think that it comes down to is, in whose interest? So, you just used the label capitalist. I would say neither capitalism nor socialism has been particularly smart on agriculture. So it's not necessarily in the labels, although what you're referring to is, and I go back to my opening point, if you take human beings seriously, if you take farmers seriously, and don't treat them as end-of-pipe products, but actually as custodians of land, or sometimes also of water courses, and there may be many different ways of describing the biodiversity that they're custodians of. We are perfectly capable of redesigning an economy that actually pays farmers to be custodians of our ecological infrastructure, on top of which they also produce food, rather than essentially squeezing them to the point where they have to destroy soil fertility to still be a farmer that produces food. And that is, I think, the moment, the civilizational moment we are in. And in very simple terms, it's not just about putting the woman farmer or the male farmer or the young farmers into the crosshairs, so to speak. It's understanding what are the incentives that a society has to empower people to operate on something that is not only viable as a livelihood, but also in the greater interests of a society. And that's where we are lagging behind. But we have many examples where countries have done this. I mean, even Europe, which spent, remember, 70% of European budgets used to go towards subsidizing farmers to produce milk that we had to throw away. This is 40 years ago. Today, we have extraordinary incentive systems in Europe that actually reward farmers for having fallow periods, for investing in soil fertility, Natura 2000. Not perfect, but it shows even in a calcified and often deliberately slowed down process by those who make a lot of money out of the current system, we have been able to break through these glass ceilings.
I'm still happy that I asked you that question. So thank you very much, Steiner. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to offer you the opportunity to 2-3 people to put their either different opinion or questions to the panel before we have a last round on panel. You look very satisfied.
Was it that bad?
Yeah,